Bottom of page 98. I started a new job at Zaro's Bakery in the small shopping center right across the street from our building in Co-op City. On the days that I worked the morning shift, I would open the shop along with the manager and her assistant. I fire up the machine that boiled the bagels and fill the display cases with the pastry and breads. Then, while waiting to open, we all settle down together for coffee and a snack, always a chocolate-covered French cruller for me, offset by a lower starch lunch, of course. I love those few minutes every day, laughing over the stories and the smells of fresh bread and coffee. It carried me back to Tio Mayo's bakery in Mayaguez. Soon the customers would be lining up for the familiar ritual of making change and small talk. I would shake my head when they tried to engage me in Yiddish. What, no Yiddish? A nice Jewish girl like you? I heard that so often that I knew the routine. My boss would explain with a bit of Yiddish I did recognize. Shiksa was technically derogatory, but she said it so affectionately that I couldn't fault it. So I'm thinking that word means like maybe somebody who's not Jewish, but she's saying it in a nice way. At least it wasn't spick. Elsewhere I get that often too. Co-op City gradually transformed from a construction site to a community. When the harshest days of winter had passed, you could see young couples strolling, little kids playing, senior citizens watching from the benches. A fair portion of the residents were Jewish, as the bakery's clientele indicated, but you saw people of every imaginable background drawn from across the 5 boroughs, a slightly more prosperous population than we were used to in the projects. Here there were teachers, police officers, firefighters, and nurses like my mother. The buildings were pristine and flawless then, the shoddiness of their construction not yet apparent. The grounds were landscaped with trees and flowers, and the whole place was lit up at night. Once Mammy planted the flag in Co-op City, it started to look like a good idea to everyone else. Alpha, married and, top of page 100, with kids by then, ended up in a building not far from us. Eventually, Titi Carmen arrived with Miriam and Eddie. Charlie with his new wife, Ruth, and finally Titi Gloria and Titi Tonio came too. Titi Aurora had beaten them all to the punch. As soon as we were settled, my mother's sister moved in with us. As fond as I'd always been of Titi Aurora, this was not good news. No sooner had we finally acquired enough space to breathe in than we were overcrowded once again. Titi slept on a daybed in the foyer. She was an early riser and grumbled if Junior and I stayed out past 10. If we had friends over, she would retire to my mother's bedroom. Titi was also a bit of a pack rat. I couldn't open a closet to grab a towel without triggering an avalanche on my head. And to say Titi Aurora was frugal would be an understatement. I don't think she has ever spent a penny on her own pleasure or bought anything that wasn't strictly necessary. She wore the same clothes year after year and mended them expertly until mending was a lost cause. The very idea of eating out in a restaurant, of spending $1 for eggs and toast, was deeply upsetting to her. Titi's frugality, in turn, so if you don't know frugality, that might be a good word to look up, was deeply upsetting to my mother, who took pride in dressing well and delighted in splurging on small pleasures. Mammy never saved, never put money away, and she would overextend herself for something that really mattered, like the encyclopedias or keeping us in Catholic schools. She often had to go into debt, but she worked long and hard to pay off those commitments. They were an odd couple, those two sisters. Neither of them showed affection, and Titi especially could be austere and forbidding, but it was also clear that they were bound to each other in a way that I didn't entirely understand. They were like two trees with buried roots so tangled that they inevitably leaned on each other and also strangled each other a bit. The 16-year difference between them made them more like mother and daughter, which is how they'd begun and how they would remain. Just as in the projects, our home was still my friend's favorite hangout, and even with Titi grumbling, the party continued, my mother coming in for a cup of coffee at regular intervals just to remind us of her presence. If we got too noisy, though, one of the neighbors was bound to call Co-op City security. The first time that happened and a uniformed guard was banging at the door, we scrambled looking for somewhere to hide 2 whole 6-packs of beer. But the next thing I knew, Mammy came bounding out of her bedroom like a tigress, fire in her eyes. She threw open the door and yelled in the hallway, "You tell those neighbors that these are young kids having fun in my house. That's why kids get into trouble, because people don't let them have fun at home." Then louder still, "If anyone has a problem with that, they can come talk to me, not call security." When she was done shouting, she invited the guard in for coffee and told the kids already gathering their stuff that they could stay, but just keep the volume down, please. Papa 102. And so, thanks to Mammy, our home became party central as well as campaign headquarters for student council elections. We threw poster-making parties, painting slogans on banners stretched all the way down the halls. We threw victory parties when we won and consolation parties when we lost. Throughout my high school years, apartment 5G 100 Dreiser Loop was the place to be. Marguerite Gudsiewicz and I had a crush on Joe. He was messing around with both of us. Uh-oh, being straight with neither. What'd he think, that girls don't talk? When he dumped us both for someone else, Marguerite and I became best friends. There was something about going to Marguerite's house that stirred memories of Abuelitos when I was small. The place was like a village, with grandparents living downstairs, Marguerite and her brother and parents upstairs, and Uncle Walter in the basement apartment. I felt right at home. Marguerite's father, John Gudowitsch, was not one to censor himself, but at least he made an effort to tone down his remarks when I was in earshot. He still had his views on those Puerto Ricans, but his kindly laugh made it impossible to take offense. In 1971, when the bigoted Archie Bunker first appeared on All in the Family, we all joked that Mr. Gudowitsch could sue CBS for copyright infringement. Still, when push came to shove, he stood up for me. One night at a party, his brother asked pointedly, "Who's the spick?" "She's a guest of ours. If you don't like it, you can get the hell out," Mr. Gudowitsch says. And he wasn't just being a good host. I learned that when Marguerite's parents married in the communities, a match between a German and a Pole, or Polish person, was virtually miscegenation. That would be a good word to look up. What's more, Marguerite's mother, Margaret, a modest woman who never talked about herself, had hidden Jews in wartime Germany. The Gudowitzes were not people who needed any lessons on the evils of prejudice. Beyond the very circumscribed world of my family and our few blocks of the South Bronx, a much wider world was opening up to me, if only in New York sort of way. If you grew up on salsa and merengue, then polkas and jitterbugs looks as if they jumped off the pages of National Geographic. To Puerto Rican taste buds, the blandness of German, Polish, and Irish food left something to be desired, but it did seem we had a lot to learn about preparing vegetables. I noticed, too, that the Michigas on display in the hallways of Co-op City or at Zaro's more than matched the volubility of Puerto Rican family life. But if we slung the kinds of insults that our Jewish neighbors regularly did, the dishonor and acrimony would have stuck for generations. I was always amazed to hear them laughing together within minutes of a flare-up. The differences were plain enough, and yet I saw that they were nothing compared with what we had in common. Just as my emotional world was growing in Co-op City, my intellectual horizons were beginning to expand at school. Top of page 104. Miss Katz, who taught us history my junior year, was different from any teacher I'd had before. In fact, from anyone I had ever known. Compared with the nuns, she seemed young and vibrant. She warned us against getting stuck in rote learning about how we needed to master abstract conceptual thinking. The meaning of all this would be revealed once we'd written our first essays. Our first what? There we sat, rows of blank faces in our regulation navy skirts, white blouses, and sweater vests. 11 years of memorization had been molded to our minds to be no less uniform. Essay? Somehow we had reached junior year in high school without having written anything beyond book reports. The nuns had always fed us facts, and we'd always parroted them back. I was very good at it. I prided myself on being able to soak up vast oceans of facts. No teacher ever asked me anything more in exchange for an A. Miss Katz had asked for something more. Her pronouncements and challenges intrigued me. What would it mean to think critically about history? How do you analyze facts? At least I learned by the value of asking for help. If I went to talk to her class, she wouldn't slam the door on me. In fact, the door was wide open and we had several long and fascinating conversations. She told me about her boyfriend, a Brazilian she described as a freedom fighter working on behalf of the poor and oppressed under the military dictatorship. I asked how, being Jewish, she'd come to work at a Catholic school, and she told me she was inspired by the nuns and priests she'd encountered in Latin America. They put their lives at risk for the sake of helping the poor. Miss Katz was the first progressive I've ever encountered up close. There certainly weren't many others at Cardinal Spellman High School in those days, and she would last for only 1 year. I remember what made her so intriguing. How could one become an interesting person? It wasn't just having a boyfriend you could describe as a hero, though that was certainly got my attention. It had more to do with her questioning the meaning of our existence and thinking in terms of a purpose in life. She was a teacher, but still educating herself, learning about the world and actively engaged in it. I began to have an intimation about the education could be for something other than opening the doors of job opportunities, in the sense of my mother's constant refrain. I wish I could say that the same kind of reflection that lit up my conversations with Miss Katz had thrown some light on the problem of writing a history essay. Somehow, her prescription for critical thinking and analysis remained abstract and tantalizing. Though I did well enough in her class, I would have to wait till college before I could really understand what she meant. It had been established that Sonia Sotomayor was not much to look at. I had a pudgy nose, I was gawky and ungraceful. I barreled down the halls of Cardinal Spellman headfirst, top of page 106, unlike those who knew how to amble with a sexy sachet. My own mother told me I had terrible taste in clothes. I did get asked out occasionally. Usually a friend's boyfriend had a friend and they were looking for a fourth to double date. Sometimes he would ask me again, and sometimes it would last for a while, but never as long as going steady. Once I was the one to put an end to it, as his contribution to a meal that some friends were making at my house. My date decided to shoplift the bacon for the BLTs. Making matters worse, it wouldn't have happened except that Mammy didn't have enough money to put together a meal for us that day. She was terribly ashamed, but she would have been horrified to learn about the shoplifting. I wanted nothing more to do with that guy. Mostly, I felt like everybody's second choice, which is why a compliment could catch me off guard, especially an unconventional one. For assistance, for instance, according to Anna and Mancho's daughter, Cheeky, who was a few years older than me, I had baseball bat legs. Thanks a lot, Cheeky. No, that's good. You see how your ankles are small and your calves curved? You've got good legs. I could hear worse. Kevin told me that Scully's dad said I was built like a brick outhouse. It's a compliment, Sonia. What kind of compliment is that? It's just an expression, Kevin insisted. It means you're well built, not like some flimsy wooden job. I couldn't believe my ears. Was this what they meant by Irish wit? Apart from dubious flattery, the truth was that Kevin Noonan made me feel attractive in a way that was new to me and not unwelcome. I, in turn, was entranced by his blue-gray eyes. I found myself scanning the hallway on the far side of Cardinal Spellman's divisive crack to catch a glimpse of that frizzy halo of sandy curls that made his slight figure stand out in the uniform crowd. On our first date, we took the train down to Manhattan. We walked the entire city. We talked for hours, and he showed me his favorite spots. The first place he took me was a tiny park on East 53rd Street where a curtain of water still runs down a stone wall. The sound of the fountain makes the city far away and turns the vast pocket park into a private cove. From that first date, we were inseparable. For the first month that I knew Kevin, he brought me a rose every single day. Oh, how sweet. One time after school, I was walking with him to the stop where he caught the bus home to Yonkers. We passed by Titi Gloria's house, and I dragged Kevin in to meet her and Tio Tonio. Really, I just wanted to postpone our parting, but as soon as we got there, Kevin turned pale and clammed up. I thought maybe he was put off because Titi Gloria and Titi Tonio kept switching to Spanish, even though they were making quite an effort welcoming us with cakes and cookies and sodas. But Kevin remained stony, and I was more than a little upset by this. The next day, when I got to school, there was no rose. I was getting seriously worried that things were over between us. But finally, Kevin confessed he had been stealing my daily roses from Tio Tony's garden. He looked at me with a hangdog expression that didn't go with the sparkling eyes and said, "There's a lot of them, Sonia." It was true. Tio Tony's rose bushes were magnificent. I laughed so hard I almost choked. I was happy to accept that the rose-colored phase of our romance was over. Now we're just a couple. Kevin practically moved in with us, except of course my mother made him go home at night. We couldn't afford much dating beyond the local pizzeria. Instead, we hung out at home, studying together, watching TV. He loved reading as much as I did, and we might silently turn the pages side by side for hours at a time. We went for walks or visited my family or worked on Kevin's car, and we talked constantly about everything imaginable. We didn't go over to his house much because his mother had a hard time accepting me. She wouldn't say it to my face, but the message came through with a tightening of the lips, a slant of the eyebrow, and a slam of the door. She would have been happier if I were Irish, or at least not Puerto Rican. I'd seen this before. One guy I dated before Kevin had ducked a teacup thrown at his head when his mother found out I was Puerto Rican. Kevin's mom was not so kinetic about her distress, seeking the counsel of the priest. He either shared her opinion on my people or else lacked the backbone to tell her that it was not a very Christian view. Kevin defended him. The parish in Yonkers was 100% Irish, he rationalized, and the priest had no choice but to affirm his community's values. I disagreed. Bigotry is not a value. At some point, I introduced Kevin to Abuelita, which made their relationship official. From then on, it was taken for granted that we would get married. Whoa! Whatever the differences between Puerto Ricans and Irish among our friends and family, a common expectation prevailed. You married your first sweetheart. The only question was whether we would do it right after high school or wait until we finished college.